I've visited roughly 60 countries throughout my life, but 8 of them have completely changed how I see the world and my own country. Or, at least my first country. The country I was born in, not the now country that I live in. Though also that too, come to think of it. Traveling and living abroad allows you to learn the nuances of a place, to go beyond the headlines and stereotypes of a country, and truly open your eyes to the reality of the world in a way hunkering down in your bubble never will. You can read or watch the news about a place all you want, but there's no substitute for visiting a place for yourself, talking with people, and hearing their story firsthand. My name's Joe Bauer, an American immigrant who's been living in Europe for the past 10 years and traveling around the world even longer. In this video, I'm going to share some of the most impactful places I've visited as an American. These places are, for better or worse, inextricably linked with US history, culture, and the way many of us from the United States and the West at large see the world. The last one is technically 2 places that go hand in hand, but you'll see what I mean soon enough. Because you're not one of those people who just scrolls around a video. You support folks like me by subscribing, watching all the way through, and helping me make sure I never have to go back to a desk job ever again. Please and thank you. First up, El Salvador. If you've been around the channel, you've already heard me wax poetic about El Salvador before, and I'm happy to do it again, and again. You know why? Because I visited El Salvador while I was living in Costa Rica, and it's the first country that forced me to come face to face with the inhumane foreign policy decisions of my government. Isn't traveling fun? For those who don't know, which I gather is most Americans, Reagan and Kissinger, seen here thinking about the absolutely sick layout he's going to get in hell, helped to fund the repressive military-backed anti-communist government that threw this small Central American country into a bloody civil war that lasted just over 12 years. In Suchitoto, which was an anti-government stronghold during the war, we visited the Centro Arte para la Paz cultural center that uses art and community to promote peace. While we were there, our host asked us, without judgment, what Americans are taught about our involvement in their civil war. I was ashamed to admit that we don't learn about it at all. And this is a theme, or a depressing motif, if you will, that you'll notice throughout this list. Places where American governments inflicted a bloody history upon them that our own people know tragically little about. Before going, I learned what we're never taught in American schools. Reagan and Kissinger funded the military government. Our government armed them, trained them, made important strategic decisions with them, and in the end, the military government was responsible for 85% of the war's atrocities. Not exactly the kind of test where a B grade is a good thing. Although the Civil War had long since ended prior to our visit, El Salvador was still largely painted by mass media as an impossibly dangerous country to visit. People warned me that I'd be shot as soon as I stepped off the plane. But in the end, I had an incredibly profound and enjoyable experience visiting the likes of Santa Tecla, Xochitoro, climbing Cerro Verde, and soaking in the sun along the sands of El Tunco. El Salvador was the first country to show me firsthand that Western media depictions of foreign countries, particularly of the global south, are often lazy and inaccurate. The people showed me that governments very rarely actually represent the everyday folks you're bound to meet on the street during the visit. Above all, El Salvador made me wonder, what else am I missing out in the world? Jordan was my first time in this region, which I'm calling the Levant after listening to the late Egyptian feminist writer and activist Nawal al-Saadawi explain why the name Middle East is a relic of British colonial language.
The minute I hear Middle East, I become upset. Because this is a colonial language. It's like third word, like post-colonial. Middle East. What? Middle to who? You have to ask yourself. Who called us? Why we are called Middle East? We were named Middle East because we were a British colony. So Egypt was Middle East relative to London. And India was called Far East relative to London because India was also a colony. So now, when I go to London, I say I go to the Middle West. And people laugh. When I go to the United States, I say I'm going to the Far West. But when she say Middle East, nobody laugh. You see? That's colonialism. That's colonial language that we need to decolonize the language.
And speaking of British colonialism, this won't be our last stop following along their wrecking trail. I visited Jordan a little over a decade ago, visiting a mix of historic sites and natural landscapes used for film sets in movies like The Martian and perhaps most famously, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. Unsurprisingly, I had an incredible time. One might even say that I have chosen wisely. Okay, well that joke would have killed with the Knights of the First Crusade. Perhaps most heartbreaking though is how cognizant people were of American or Western representations of them. For instance, I was picked up at the airport by a guy named Osama who felt compelled to reassure me that it's just a common name that means lion or lion-like in Arabic, symbolizing strength, courage, and leadership.
Why should I change? He's the one who sucks.
I also met folks who work in tourism who were frustrated with what they called their bad neighbors, who are largely responsible for all the conflicts in the region that lead Western media to paint the entire Levant as too dangerous to visit. Now granted, their neighbors are currently making it difficult yet again to visit. But within Jordan itself, I felt completely safe during my entire visit and wouldn't hesitate to go back whenever possible. Growing up in the US, Poland was ground zero for the Holocaust, home to the Nazi death camps of Auschwitz and Treblinka. Even long after the war, my imagination of Poland was filtered through a hazy, lifeless gray prism that American Cold War movies used to depict the entire Soviet Union and anything east of the Berlin Wall. But then I visited Poland, first Warsaw and later on Krakow and Gdansk over several trips. You never know it from the movies I grew up with, but Poland, as it turns out, is freaking beautiful. And wouldn't you know it, the sun does come out there. I mean, look at Krakow, a place I've visited 3 times, most recently to write about the city's milk bar culture. Some of my favorite memories of living in and traveling around Europe involve Poland and noshing on some pierogies. And I still have plenty of places on my Polish wish list that I hope to visit sooner rather than later. Most Americans grow up knowing Germany exclusively through its history, so it's not a great first impression to put it mildly. Fortunately, I had the opportunity to visit twice before moving here, so I could see firsthand both how the country continues to reflect on its history and how the people in many respects accept the responsibility history has handed them to make sure it doesn't repeat itself. I could also see how the people themselves, particularly those enjoying themselves on a hike or basking underneath the spring sun with a glass of wine, are actually a pretty cheerful bunch, far from the barking stereotype of the angry German. But living here and becoming even more attuned to the history, it reinforces the notion that what happened here can happen anywhere. Because of the war and the Holocaust, modern American history is inextricably intertwined with modern German history. We were combatants, we helped run the trials that persecuted their war criminals, we helped keep West Berlin alive during the Soviet blockade, and we celebrated with them when the wall finally came down. I live in the former East, but within a short walk of where the wall once stood. I regularly run back and forth across those scars, and it never gets old. Living in Germany is to be constantly reminded of history, given the pervasiveness of memorials reflecting on the past. Nie wieder, or never again, is a refrain echoed throughout protests to this day, and it's a responsibility new citizens, such as myself, have to accept. I'm technically also supposed to scold strangers on the street for breaking arbitrary rules I've made up, but that's a topic for another video. Growing up in the US, I only knew of Vietnam through war movies. I knew nothing of the people or their culture. They were merely screaming villains in the background killing innocent Americans in an unjust war, handing the US their first official loss.
We're American soldiers! We've been kicking ass for 200 years! We're 10-1!
But within my lifetime, Vietnam has become a dream destination for many American and Western travelers in general, and after spending a week there, I can say it's for good reason. There are few places quite like Vietnam where I've experienced such a stark contrast between the chaotic cacophony of city life and the peace of the countryside just a short train ride away. It's also the first time I rode a motorbike, clenching onto the handlebars for dear life and slowly easing into it by the time we got to Laos. Despite my general loathing for all things vehicular, I gotta say, I can see the appeal. Although the war against Americans isn't front and center on the ground, you can visit the Hoa Lo prison turned museum and see the war from their perspective. It is admittedly heavily flavored with communist propaganda, with stories of just how well American prisoners of war were treated. It's easy to roll your eyes, but it does make you wonder, what kind of propaganda are we getting served in our own history? I think the answer won't surprise you quite a bit. And again, that's just one of the many gifts of travel. It forces you to question things you accepted as true back home. After visiting Vietnam, we continued to Laos, a place that I wanted to visit since watching Anthony Bourdain's episode on the country. Now, unlike Vietnam, Laos is a country I'm certain most Americans don't know much about if they could even place it on a map. But in reality, we should know something about it because our government made Laos the most bombed country in the world per capita through heavy aerial attacks during the Vietnam War. Between 1964 and 1973, we dropped more than 2 million tons of bombs on Laos. An estimated 80 million cluster bombs failed to detonate in Laos during the Vietnam War, remaining active in the ground today. There have been roughly 50,000 casualties since 1975, half of them children. It all ties to why Anthony Bourdain famously wished Henry Kissinger harm on several occasions.
Would it displease you if I walked over and punched Henry Kissinger in the face?
But traveling to Laos today is an absolute privilege. We learned from the skilled hands at the Living Land Company the arduous task of growing and harvesting rice, watched the devout offer food to local Buddhist monks during the morning alms, had lunch with the Hmong hosts, and catapulted into a lagoon to the apparent enjoyment of Chinese tourists. In all, after visiting 60-some countries, it remains one of my favorite places in the world. And I hope to return for many more visits, if they'll take me back. I started writing this list before I visited Greenland, but halfway through my week-long visit, I knew I had a new addition for the list. Greenland is not a place most Americans ever think about growing up, only because of the Orange Man, as one Greenlandic person called him, as Greenland regularly entered the American consciousness. Now, by this point, I've traveled enough to know that most people do not hold individual citizens responsible for the idiocy of their government. Only when I asked did people share their feelings of the sudden tug-of-war between Trump and Denmark. My experience on the ground only echoes what we already know. Greenlanders do not want to be Americans. They eventually would like to be independent, but they feel they still need Denmark's support in the short term despite their violent colonial history. But what really hit me was this. Greenland is in the news for the wrong reasons. We shouldn't be talking about Trump. We should be talking about climate change and what Greenland is revealing about the state of our world. Scientists are currently studying the Greenlandic ice sheet to better understand how quickly it's melting, possibly pushing the Atlantic Ocean towards a critical climate tipping point. I had the once-in-a-lifetime privilege to hike across a small section of the ice sheet, and I was moved beyond words. I'm not one to, get particularly emotional in nature, but I have to admit, I got a little verklempt. Especially when our guide asked us to pause for a moment of silence at the end so we could appreciate the stillness of the landscape. It was truly a quiet unlike anything I'd experienced before, and easily one of the highlights of my life. Alrighty folks, buckle up, we end on a double whammy. I did a series of videos on our trip to Israel and Palestine in May of 2023, before October 7th, and obviously before Israel started this war with Iran alongside the United States. As I said in those videos, there's absolutely nothing I could say then or that I can say here that will please everyone watching this. I had my own complex thoughts about it all before going in, and I still have them. But I'm not making this video to air those out and watch the comments devolve into some kind of potpourri of, well, what about this? This video is about the places that most impacted me as an American traveling around the world and challenging the mainstream Western narrative that creates all kinds of biases in our minds. By that measure, visiting Israel and crossing into the West Bank of Palestine completely upended media representations I've seen of both countries and their people, especially Palestinians. It makes it all the more frustrating to witness the devastation of Gaza and the region being thrust further into war. Because when you're on the ground, whether it's in Tel Aviv or wandering the streets of Bethlehem, you don't see people calling for rockets to be shot at each other. What you do see are people who just want to live in peace, particularly Mustafa, who grew up in and is raising his daughter in the Aida refugee camp. He showed us the US-made tear gas canisters used by the Israeli military against the refugees. And there's Wissam, a hotel manager in Bethlehem, who shared these parting words.
We don't want people to take positions in this conflict because I believe that if you take positions, especially tough radical positions, you make the conflict bigger and wider, and we don't want this to happen. The idea behind this is to break down the stereotypes and also create a real understanding for the situation and for the Palestinians.
And that's the ethos of this entire video and the purpose behind much of my travel. To break down the stereotypes and show a, dare I say, more authentic picture of what life is really like on the ground. Whether it's in comparing life in Europe versus the US, or walking the streets of Santa Tecla with a new friend. Because I don't pretend to know it all. I am a firm believer in the idea that the more you travel, the less you know, but with just one caveat. I know we don't get the full picture through the breaking news alerts on our smartphones and televisions. And though I don't know what the truth is, I do know you'll get closer to it when you travel. But as much as travel has changed me as an American, living in Europe has changed me as a person. In this video, I share 7 ways I've changed since moving to Germany 10 years ago. There's one thing that I really did not see coming. No, really, that's not just like a cheeky play on words. I truly did not see, damn it, not see. Not... Something happened that was unexpected. Just watch the damn thing.